The Florida Everglades were shrouded in oppressive August humidity, covering that would not lift as night fell. Ray, the detective. Throughout his 23 years with the Broward County Sheriff's Office, Martinez witnessed a lot, but nothing fully prepared him for what he saw as he traveled through the dark waters of Canal 37 on that hot Tuesday afternoon in 2022. At 3:47, a regular call had come in. Report from a monthly maintenance sweep carried out by the county drainage crew. What they discovered would shatter. A case that had been sitting in the cold files for 55 years. Martinez stood knee-deep in the brackish water and observed the crane operator gently maneuvering the corroded wreck of a 1966 Harley-Davidson Electroglide that was once immaculate. The bank of the canal. Water gushed out every nook and cranny of the apparatus, bringing with it decades of algae, silt, and a distinct smell of decay. The corrosion had long since taken over the motorcycle's chrome. The once brilliant blue paint job has been mottled, canvas covered in barnacle scars and rust. However, Martinez's pulse quickened because, not the bike's actual state, but what held together in spite of its submerged tomb. Even if the leather saddlebags were brown by their watery incarceration, had managed to survive. The superior craftsmanship of real cowhide and brass fixtures had produced a seal that water and time were unable to penetrate. Entirely, with a wet thump that seemed to reverberate, the motorcycle landed on the muddy bank. Martinez could see the obvious protrusion of contents across the sawdust, still safe in their worn pouches. His thoughts instantly shifted to the James Franklin case. Was the missing persons report that had plagued the oldest investigators in the department. Holloway was an exceptional private detective who disappeared on September 15, 1967. In South Florida law enforcement circles, Jimmy Holloway's disappearance had become somewhat of a legend past. From veteran to rookie, it was like a ghost story around the coffee pot in the station house. This man had made his living by discovering the secrets of others and locating unfaithful spouses and fugitive youths, exposing corporate malfeasance and insurance fraud, with the street smarts of a con artist and the persistence of a bloodhound. However, every lead fell cold after he disappeared, and every witness stated ignorance, and each hypothesis fell apart when examined. Martinez took out his phone and called the Miami-Dade Police Department's Cold Case Division's Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chun. Given the possibility that Holloway's probe would reveal this information, interagency cooperation would be necessary. Had gone beyond county boundaries. While he awaited her response, he examined observing the Florida license plate on the motorcycle up close, still hardly seen via aquatic growth layers. The lettering and numbers were unintelligible, but the characteristic orange and the black color palette was clearly from the middle of the 1960s. When Chen's voice, Martinez experienced a familiar rush of excitement as the speaker crackled. That resulted from cracking open a case. This is Martinez, Lieutenant, down at Broward Canal 37. You must come down here immediately. I believe we just discovered Jimmy Holloway's bicycle. There was a long period of stillness on the other end. Chen answered a few seconds later, her tone tense with restrained enthusiasm. After all this time, are you sure? The description is exactly right. 66 electrolyte chrome and blue leather. Sarah and saddlebags. The luggage seemed to be undamaged. Whatever Jimmy was holding at the time, he may still be recoverable if he vanishes. After an hour, Canal 37 looked like a major network television drama's crime scene. Technicians of evidence rushed over the motorcycle, taking pictures from every aspect like archaeologists studying a priceless relic, categorizing every aspect, getting ready to return their discovery to the forensics lab where an investigation could start. Chen showed up carrying a big manila folder. Includes records, eyewitness accounts, and pictures that had been gathered over the years whenever someone claimed to possess fresh information regarding the private eye that went missing. As he observed the meticulously planned dance of gathering evidence, his mind shifted to the guy who had possessed this machine who had chased it through Miami's streets and beyond, of justice and truth for pay. Holloway, James Franklin, was 34 years old at the time of his disappearance, a former military police officer who had parlayed his investigative abilities into a prosperous private practice. As per, he had been working multiple cases concurrently at the time of the original case files. The moment of his disappearance, including a case involving a missing person, a workers' compensation fraud investigation for a major insurance company, and the daughter of a wealthy businessman, corporation, and what seemed to be a standard case of infidelity for a well-known lawyer's spouse. When investigators found out, the mystery had grown more complex. That Holloway had taken out $8,000 from his company account early on. On September 13, 1967, he informed his secretary that I would come back in 48 hours to follow up on a promising lead. His last. On September 14th, witnesses reported seeing him in different places, which led to documented activity. Miami, reportedly meeting with sources and carrying out surveillance. No one acknowledged seeing him alive after that. His personal belongings and residence had not been disturbed. Abandoned. His other car, a 1964 Ford Mustang, was still parked in its allocated space behind his downtown Miami office building. The large file was opened by Detective Chun and started going over the witness accounts that had been gathered right after Holloway's vanishing. Margaret Flanders, his secretary, had been the final person to describe him as enthusiastic about a breakthrough in one of his cases in an official conversation, but declining to give details. She had thought it strange that he would accept such a big amount of money, since Holloway was usually quite cautious when dealing with money and kept strict documentation of every company expense. Numerous individuals were interviewed by the initial investigating police to Holloway's current cases, from the insurance adjusters who had been recruited to the concerned parents of the missing girl, to look at dubious allegations. Every interview has produced bits and pieces of facts, but no clear image of the private investigator's possible fate. A few witnesses proposed that Holloway had been looking over his shoulder and appearing tense in the weeks preceding his abduction, and making cryptic remarks about being on the verge of discovering something important. Others maintained that he had appeared to be as confident, professional, and typical as ever. Martinez found himself researching the case as the afternoon went on and the gathering of evidence proceeded. Chen had brought several pictures. In the traditional 1960s fashion, Holloway had been a handsome man with thick, black hair, well-groomed, deep brown eyes, and the kind of self-assured, a smile that could persuade reluctant witnesses to divulge information. He was 5 feet, 10 inches tall, weighing about 170 pounds, and lacking any noticeable scars or tattoos. He was depicted in the pictures in a variety of locations throughout his office, always flawlessly attired in well-tailored suits that exuded professionalism and success. Martinez was drawn to one certain picture, an unguarded photo at a social gathering displaying. Holloway was engrossed in a conversation with a gorgeous blonde woman whose face was partially hidden by the shade. The notation on the back indicates that Holloway's personal belongings contain a photograph, but no one could identify the woman or ascertain the image's significance. Chen observed Martinez examining the snapshot and took a closer look at it. Every detective involved in this case, Chen pointed to the enigmatic woman and remarked, has wondered about her. According to Margaret Flanders, she had never seen her before, and none of Holloway's. She might also be recognized by familiar associates. She might be a client. The issue with this case is that it may have nothing to do with his disappearance, are insufficiently strong evidence, and too many variables. The forensics team had completed their initial assessment of the motorcycle and were getting ready to bring it to the lab for additional thorough examination. Martinez observed as they raised each saddlebag with care, observing the weight and the leather's seeming integrity in spite of its extended immersion. The metalwork and brass buckles were severely corroded, but the bags themselves seemed to have maintained its fundamental framework. Whatever secrets Jimmy Holloway had been harboring on that fateful September day may now be revealed, despite the fact that the next 55 years would bring substantial difficulties in recovering evidence. As the sun started to set over the Everglades, creating lengthy shadows across the canal where the motorcyclist had, after more than 50 years of rest, Martinez began to ponder what had caused this. Time. Had Holloway been killed and his body disposed of somewhere else had he planned his own abduction and somehow lost control of his motorcycle in the canal? Procedure? Or was there a more intricate explanation that will only become apparent once the contents of the saddlebags were opened and inspected? Martinez had time to examine his knowledge of the Everglades topography during the way back to headquarters in the neighborhood in 1967. At that time, a large portion of what is today Canal 37 had been a portion of an undeveloped wetlands and agricultural areas that had been transformed into built suburban sprawl. Large drainage system intended to prevent flooding during hurricane season, but it had also functioned as a convenient location to dispose of anything from stolen goods to construction debris. Automobiles. It was hardly shocking that Holloway's motorcycle had gone unnoticed for so long, considering the isolated location and the propensity of submerged objects to eventually become buried in sediment. Martinez worked with Chun at the Broward County Station to put together a collaborative task team to examine the Holloway case files and get ready for anything. The forensic analysis of the motorcycle may yield new information, and its contents. The initial case investigators had either retired or died, but their careful records provide a strong basis for reopening the investigation. Every piece of evidence would have to be re-examined using contemporary forensic methods and contrasted with the materials that had managed to survive in those enigmatic saddlebags. On the outskirts of Fort Lauderdale, the laboratory was housed in an unremarkable structure with pristine white hallways and climate-controlled exam rooms, which stand in sharp contrast to the muggy chaos of the Canal 37 crime site. Chief forensic expert Dr. Patricia Valdez, examiner, had been informed of the importance of the motorbike finding and had made time in her schedule to physically supervise the analysis while Martinez and Chun saw an observation window. Valdez and her group started the careful procedure of looking at the first saddlebag. The water had softened the leather, but it had not entirely deteriorated, making it possible for the specialists to gently repair the corroded buckles, free without causing further harm. When the first bag's flap was raised, for the first time in 55 years, Martinez disclosed its contents, holding his breath with expectation. Within, encased in what seemed to be several coats of oiled canvas and heavy-duty plastic, a leather-bound notepad, many manila envelopes, and what appeared to be documents wrapped in protective covers. Dr. Valdez collaborated with the patience of a surgeon, removing each piece with care and putting it in a sterile examination tray. Important defense against water damage has been offered by layers of protective wrapping, and although there was obvious deterioration, most of the material seemed to be in better shape than anyone had imagined. Documents, photos, and handwritten messages seemed to be inside the manila envelopes, but the notebook was clearly well used, with Holloway's characteristic handwriting all over the pages. Even more fascinating items were found in the second saddlebag, including a tiny revolver covered in many layers of plastic sheeting and oiled cloth, a manila envelope labeled Insurance Confidential, and multiple rolls of cash that had been similarly secured. In Holloway's meticulous calligraphy, Martinez's heart raced upon realizing they were examining what could have been Holloway's entire case files at the time of his vanishing, preserved as a time capsule from a period when private. Instead than using computer databases and digital surveillance, investigators relied on instinct and shoe leather. After cataloging and preparing the material for in-depth analysis, Chin started phoning any survivors. Witnesses from the initial inquiry. Holloway's secretary, Margaret Flanders, had died in 1993 but her daughter continued to reside in the Miami region and may have heard tales. A number of Holloway's previous clients revealed her mother's encounters with the unaccounted-for private investigator. Despite being well into their 80s and 90s, they were still alive and may still give further context for any information found in the files that were recovered. The initial discovery occurred when Dr. Valdez had a chance to look at a few of the pictures that had been kept safe in the saddlebags. Were astonishingly well-maintained given their age and storage circumstances, while several displayed water damage around the edges. Scenes that would have been controversial in 1967 were captured on camera, but by 2022 standards was nearly charming, depicting a middle-aged man in compromising relationships with a woman who was obviously not his spouse. Evidence of adultery that would have been worth a lot in those days' divorce proceedings. More interesting were Holloway's notebook's handwritten entries, which started to depict an NBC probe that had expanded, far more complicated than a straightforward instance of adultery. Allusions to insurance fraud, dangerous connections, and missing money indicated that Holloway had made a mistake. On to something far more significant than a husband's infidelity. One specific entry, dated September 12, 1967, stated, "Tomorrow is the scheduled meeting with the informant. At night, claims to have evidence linking the missing girl and the insurance claims. Might be the break. We must exercise caution. They don't engage in gaming." In an attempt to put together the chronology of Holloway's last days, Martinez examined the journal entries. The investigator had obviously been managing several cases, but there appear to be links between them that he was only starting to comprehend. References to particular places in the Miami area, including a number that were isolated locations in 1967 but were now significant economic developments, indicated that Holloway had been meeting with informants and conducting surveillance in remote areas. Throughout the last week of his life, Insurance Secret was written on the manila envelope, included records that, at the time, would have been explosive, exposing a intricate plan involving manufactured accidents, false workers' compensation claims, and dishonest medical professionals who supported fictitious injury claims using fraudulent documentation. The plans seemed to entail false claims totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, a significant amount that would be worth several million dollars in today's currencies in the 1960s. The documents contain the names of a number of well-known business executives and even a few political heavyweights who were still, even though the majority had passed away, they were still well-known in South Florida decades later. After reviewing the insurance fraud paperwork, Martinez started to see why Jimmy Holloway might have been viewed as a danger to influential interests. The plan outlined in it revealed a web of corruption that included both white-collar workers and street-level criminals, and possibly had ties to families involved in organized crime that were extending their activities into South Florida during the 1960s' explosive growth. The private investigator had been carefully constructing a case that had the potential to destroy an entire corruption network, unaware that his Chun coordinated with the district since the probe put him in grave danger. Attorney's office to ascertain whether any of the offenses included in Holloway's records were still within the prosecution's statute of limitations. Although the majority of fraud instances were also, the material may nevertheless be useful for comprehending what had occurred to the people who were too old to be prosecuted. Investigator on his own. If Holloway had been killed to keep his discoveries from being made public, his assassin, or it's possible the murderers are still alive and facing homicide charges, there is no statute of limitations. The motorcycle's forensic analysis provided more information regarding the conditions surrounding its submersion. Patterns of damage to the engine and frame implied that rather than unintentionally ending up in the canal, the bike had been pushed or propelled there on purpose. Within the water, paint chips and metal pieces discovered under a microscope embedded in the frame showed that the motorcycle had just come in contact with another car, entered the water, perhaps as a result of a fight or accident. But the Extended submersion prevented the recovery of biological evidence that could be conclusively connected to particular people. Additionally, Dr. Valdez's group found traces, evidence on the motorcycle's various surfaces, such as cloth fibers, and further information that could shed light on the events surrounding its submersion. While the deterioration brought about 55 years underwater made conclusive analysis difficult, however, the data indicated that items compatible with a struggle or violent altercation had come into contact with the motorcycle before going into the canal. As the inquiry went on, Martinez started contacting retired police officers who had served in the Miami region in the 1960s and 70s. Detective Frank was one name that kept coming up in the old case files. Morrison continued to work on the case after serving as the primary investigator for Holloway's disappearance. Informally, even after he retired in 1985, Morrison was now 83 years old and still alive in a Fort Lauderdale retirement center, yet he could still clearly recall the episode. During their initial phone call, Morrison said Martinez, "I always knew we'd find that bike someday." Jimmy was too intelligent to simply depart without a trace unless someone forced him to do so. He was proud of that motorcycle and happiness, and he would never have given it up willingly. "We looked through every lake, every canal, every marsh 50 miles or less from Miami. However, the Everglades were enormous, and there were so many canals that we were unable to cover them all." Morrison consented to see Martinez and Chunt to discuss his findings from the initial investigation and go over the collected evidence. The retired detective's memories were astonishingly detailed despite his senior age, and he was able to supply many of the names and places described in Holloway's notes have context. Additionally, he disclosed details not included in the official case files, such as his thoughts regarding corruption in a number of law enforcement organizations that may have jeopardized the first inquiry. During their discussion at the retiring, Morrison clarified that some people didn't want Jimmy's cases resolved. Coffee store in the community, significant individuals with ties to City Hall, and the county courtroom. I was often advised to let sleeping dogs lie that it would be detrimental to my profession to pursue some leads. I disregarded their cautions as much as I could. However, I believe that Jimmy's disappearance conveyed a message that even I was unable to fully ignore. The gathering. Morrison offered significant insights into Miami's social and political milieu in the late 1960s when the city was growing and developing quickly, which gave organized crime and corruption chances. According to Holloway's records, there was only one insurance fraud scheme, a component of a wider web of illicit operations that included political bribery, money laundering, and relationships with northeastern organized criminal gangs who were extending their activities into South Florida to exploit the area's expansion and comparatively low level of law enforcement. Morrison additionally supplied crucial details regarding the enigmatic blonde woman in the picture discovered among Holloway's personal belongings. The retired ET detective stated that she was thought to be associated with a well-known businessman involved in the insurance fraud scheme, potentially acting as connections between lawful companies and illicit organizations. Although a number of witnesses had reported seeing her with different suspects, she had never been officially identified or questioned, and it was unclear where she was at the time. As the forensic investigation proceeded, more proof surfaced to bolster the hypothesis that Holloway had been killed in order to keep his investigation from being made public. The revolver discovered in the saddlebags revealed evidence that the motorcycle was recently repaired and cleaned before it entered the canal, indicating that Holloway may have expected an encounter with dangerous people because he had been ready for problems. The weapon's existence suggested that the private investigator had taken measures and was conscious of the risks involved in his inquiry. To keep himself safe, Holloway's handwritten remarks in his notebook grew more frantic and suspicious in the days before he vanished, indicating that he knew he was being observed and possibly pursued. Just one entry, dated September 11th, 4 days prior to his disappearance, stated, "They know I'm. Margaret doesn't know where I am. I've changed hotels twice this week. Remaining. Although the meeting may be risky, it's the only chance to obtain the last evidence we require. If something were to happen to me, everything crucial is in the saddlebags. This entry turned out to be foretelling because it seemed that Holloway had, in fact, planned for the prospect of his own demise by obtaining his closest significant evidence in his motorcycle saddlebags waterproofing. The private investigator had evidently believed that his study would eventually be found and the truth would come to light, even if he was slain. It never occurred to him that it would take 55 years for his meticulously kept evidence to be made public. Chen put together a group of investigators to pursue the leads in Holloway's records, concentrating on people who were still living and might provide details about what happened. Of 1967, although most of the main suspects had passed away from natural reasons in the decades that followed, a number of their family members and colleagues continued to reside in the South Florida region and could perhaps offer more details regarding the insurance fraud scheme and how it relates to Holloway's disappearance. When investigators spoke with Eleanor Vasquez, the Roberto Vasquez's 84-year-old widow, who had been referenced multiple times in a crucial player in the insurance fraud scheme, is Holloway's notes. At first, Mrs. Vasquez insisted that she had no knowledge of her late husband's business dealings, had operated a modest construction company as a legal businessman, but when faced with certain evidence from the retrieved files, she showed signs of anguish and acknowledged that she had been bearing the weight of dreadful knowledge for almost 50 years. Mrs. Vasquez claims that in the middle of the 1960s, the husband was approached by members of a criminal family in Miami and forced into using a mix of monetary rewards and intimidation to engage in the insurance fraud scheme. His family, Jimmy Holloway, started looking into the false allegations. Roberto Vasquez was instructed to set up a meeting with the private investigator under the guise of supplying details that might aid in the resolution of one of his cases involving missing persons. Rather, the gathering had been a ruse to kill Holloway before he potentially reveal the entire scheme. Mrs. Vasquez's testimony offered important information on Holloway's demise, such as the meeting site, location, and the identities of a number of people who had participated in the murder's preparation and execution. She claimed that Holloway had been enticed to a secluded location close to the western edge of the Everglades on September 14, 1967. In the evening, he was approached by armed men who insisted that he stop his investigations and handed over any material pertaining to his insurance fraud inquiry. Holloway was sought after he refused to cooperate and tried to flee on his motorcycle, and finally found themselves cornered close to Canal 37. During the altercation, gunfire was fired, leaving Holloway mortally injured. His body was disposed of in a different spot far within the Everglades, and in order to remove any tangible proof, his motorcycle was pushed into the canal. Holloway's body was never found. Hence, the scheme had been somewhat successful in linking the crime to his killers. Discovered, and the initial inquiry had halted because there was little proof and the intimidation of possible witnesses. Mrs. Vasquez named 3 men who had played a direct role in Holloway's murder, while 2 had passed away in the decades that followed due to natural causes. Anthony Tony Moroni, the third man, was apparently still alive at the age of 79, but had been suffering from terminal dementia and lived under a false identity for a number of years. Moroni had been a mid-level enforcer for the criminal organization and was allegedly present when the altercation took place. Holloway's demise, but Mrs. Vasquez wasn't sure who had fired the lethal bullets. The discovery that Moroni was a survivor of Holloway's. For the contemporary investigation, murder offered both a task and an opportunity. Even though he was still alive and would face murder charges, his senior age and declining, his dementia-related mental illness made it improbable that he would be able to deliver trustworthy testimony or stand trial. Testimony of incidents that occurred 55 years prior, but his presence offered a chance to finally resolve one of the oldest unresolved issues in South Florida. to give Jimmy Holloway's memory some justice. Martinez and, in order to interrogate Moroni, went to Naples with the state attorney's office official and A. Moroni lived in a nursing facility with a geriatric psychiatrist who would assess his mental capacity. State-of-the-art clinic that specialized in treating senior citizens with a variety of forms of cognitive impairment, and the staff's initial reluctance to permit the interview stemmed from worries about their patients' precarious mental health and the possible psychological effects of talking about painful experiences from the man they discovered had little in common with the perilous criminal identified in 1960s and 1970s law enforcement data. Moroni seemed weak and disoriented, having trouble recalling previous events. While occasionally exhibiting flashes of insight regarding events from decades ago. Earlier, when asked about Jimmy Holloway, he first stated that he no recollection of the private investigator's name or the circumstances surrounding his absence, but he became, when shown pictures of the recovered motorcycle, he became clearly angry. But as the interview went on and particulars of the case were brought up, Moroni started to show indications of identification and growing discomfort when viewing images of Holloway and records pertaining to the insurance fraud probe. The old man grew more irritated. He started speaking incoherently about the detective and the family's directives, while although remarks were frequently illogical and challenging to understand, they offered sufficient support for Mrs. Vasquez's account to bolster the hypothesis that he had a direct hand in Holloway's demise. Although Moroni had moderate to severe dementia, a mental assessment found that he maintained enough knowledge of good and wrong to perhaps be charged with a crime, but in actuality, it seemed extremely unlikely that he would survive long enough to see a trial through due to his health, and even if he did, his mental state would make it challenging to develop a significant conviction that would meet the standards of justice for society and the EIB victim. In spite of these obstacles, the state Moroni was charged with murder by the attorney's office, both to provide closure for the case and to demonstrate that there was no statute of limitations on homicide justice. Victims, considering Moroni's state, the charges were mainly symbolic. Old age, but they served as a crucial recognition that the death of Holloway had been a crime deserving of governmental acknowledgement and legal action. Moroni passed away quietly in his sleep 6 weeks after being formally indicted, leaving detectives to piece together any surviving information regarding Jimmy Holloway's murder. Together the last details of the narrative from the testimony and material they had already gathered. The conclusion of a riddle that had plagued South Florida law enforcement for more than 5 years was solved by the Holloway case. Decades, but it also brought up unsettling concerns about the number of other atrocities from that time period that had been concealed by intimidation and corruption. The insurance fraud scheme that had cost Jimmy Holloway's life served as an illustration of the pervasive structured. During Miami's fast expansion in the 1960s and 1970s, criminal activity developed when weak. A virtual utopia for illicit organizations had been established by law enforcement and widespread government corruption. Chin arranged a news conference to declare the case's outcome, attracting media interest from all over the nation as journalists and fans of real crime discovered the secret investigator who had made the ultimate sacrifice in order to unearth the story of Jimmy Holloway's motorcycle coming out of its wet grave after 55 years attracted the public's attention and acted as a potent reminder that, despite occasional delays, justice may still be served by perseverance and contemporary investigation methods. The forensic analysis of a number of other unresolved cases from the same era also attracted renewed attention as a result of Holloway's retrieved material. Investigators came to the conclusion that the private investigator's thorough record might have information about other crimes that had never been thoroughly examined. His files made reference to a number of unsolved missing person cases, such as the disappearance of Rebecca Santos, the daughter of a wealthy businessman, whose case had connected Holloway to the criminal network that ultimately killed him. Motivated by his professional ambition to cracking cold cases and his respect for Holloway's commitment to his career, Martinez became personally committed in pursuing these extra leads. In August 1967, Rebecca Santos vanished at the age of 19, a few weeks before Holloway went missing. After the police investigation had stagnated due to a lack of clues and what seemed to be intentional obstruction by those connected to organized crime, her father, construction magnate Eduardo Santos, engaged a private investigator to locate his daughter. According to Holloway's notes, he may have constructed a theory linking Rebecca's disappearance to the insurance fraud scheme as collateral damage from his investigation into organized criminal operations or as leverage against her father. Rebecca may have discove. Crime families have substantially infiltrated the construction industry in particular, using respectable companies as fronts for money laundering and other illicit activities, as well as providing cover for more violent crimes like extortion and murder. Rebecca's father, Eduardo Santos, passed away in 1994 without ever finding out what had happened to his daughter, but his surviving relatives continued to hold out hope that the reopened investigation would at last yield answers. Over the years, his son, Roberto Santos, who is now a prosperous lawyer in his 70s, had never given up looking for his sister. He had kept up prize offers and engaged private detectives on occasion, but none had been able to find the information that had killed Jimmy Holloway. The corruption in law enforcement that had impeded the first investigations was also revealed by the discovery of Jimmy Holloway's files. A roadmap for comprehending how cases had been twisted and evidence had vanished was offered by references to certain police officials and investigators who had been compromised by organized crime. Even though the majority of the dishonest officials had since passed away, their deeds had created an environment of impunity that allowed criminal groups to function with very little restriction and permitted killers like those who killed Holloway to evade punishment. Martinez spent decades thinking about the similarities between the difficulties faced by investigators in the 1960s and contemporary law enforcement, seeing that despite tremendous advancements in technology, the pursuit of justice was still constantly threatened by the underlying issues of political meddling, intimidation, and corruption. Jimmy Holloway's story served as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale about the perils faced by those who decide to take on large criminal interests without sufficient assistance and defense from law enforcement, all of which were highly sophisticated for a private investigator working in the pre-computer era. He showed his professional paranoia and his dedication to making sure his work would endure, even if he did not, by preparing for the potential of his own death. 5.5 decades later, his own murder was solved thanks in large part to this insight. Martinez found himself considering the case's wider ramifications for contemporary law enforcement as the investigation came to an end and the numerous court cases were resolved. Jimmy Holloway's murder took 55 years to solve, which demonstrated the difficulties faced by detectives without access to contemporary technology, as well as the need of perseverance in seeking justice for victims of crime, even when cases were hopeless and witnesses were either dead or dispersed. The case also demonstrated the crucial role private investigators had played in law enforcement in a time when corruption was more pervasive and police resources were scarce than they are today. Important gaps in the official investigation of organized crime operations have been filled. Even though the private investigator had paid the ultimate price for his commitment to his career, the aim he had died pursuing had finally been accomplished thanks to his meticulously maintained evidence. Revealing the truth and holding his murderers accountable for their actions, even though it took decades longer than it should have. The case inspired present and future investigators by showing that even the most complex criminal conspiracies could be defeated by a commitment to justice and meticulous attention to detail, and that the truth, no matter how long hidden, could eventually surface to further the cause of justice. In addition to the settlement of his own murder, Jimmy Holloway's legacy persisted in other cases that were resolved with the use of information from his recovered files and in the increased dedication to looking into long-forgotten or abandoned historical murders. Martinez considered the peculiar journey that had started with a normal canal maintenance operation and concluded with the resolution of one of South Florida's most persistent mysteries as he submitted his final report on the Holloway inquiry. The motorcycle had been found by pure happenstance, but the same traits that had made Jimmy Holloway a successful detective were needed to solve the case: perseverance, meticulousness, and an unshakable dedication to finding the truth, regardless of the emotional cost or the amount of time needed to bring victims and their families justice.